Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Medicine Show. The world is a changed place since last we talked. So this time, I'll be talking about some of the things that have changed, and some of the things that we can all expect in the coming times. And I will try to clarify some of the information and misinformation that we're all seeing out there. And lastly, I'll talk some about what I'm doing in my own practice to try and deal with what's going on in my community and what you might be able to do in your lives for the same purpose. So here's a very simple representation of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It has a central part that is made of RNA and some other proteins. It has a capsid, which is made out of proteins and lipids. And then it has spike proteins, which stick out in all directions from it, which are sort of the most distinctive feature of this virus. These proteins allow it to attach itself to this ACE2, that's angiotensin converting enzyme 2, which is another protein that is found on the surface of some lung cells and some other cells in the body. Then once it has docked there, it releases RNA and enzymes into the lung cell and uses the substances and structures in the lung cell to create more virions, more particles of virus. The viral particles then begin escaping by breaking through the membrane of the cell, and this is where things start to get interesting. So within the lungs, there are lots and lots of tiny little air sacs, which are made up of a lining of cells and an airspace, an empty airspace, and then on the outside of them, they're in contact with capillaries, tiny blood vessels, and this helps to facilitate the transfer of gases between the blood and the lungs, ideally with oxygen coming in and carbon dioxide going out of the bloodstream. In this case, the virus particles in black here have begun to get into the cells, cause the cells to break, and just like we saw before, release more viral particles, which then can go and get into other cells. They can also accumulate in fluid inside of the air sac, which causes a sense of fullness in the lungs, leads to coughing, and then gets that fluid with the viruses in it expelled out into the environment where it can be breathed in or otherwise contracted by another person. On December 31st of 2019, China informed the World Health Organization of a cluster of cases of pneumonia of unknown origin in Wuhan, Hubei province. Several of these individuals had a connection to the same market in Wuhan, and it was unknown at the time whether the illness was transmitted from person to person or whether it was acquired directly through contact with animals or through some other means. A few days later, the World Health Organization made an announcement that China had reported this cluster of pneumonia cases, which at the time included no deaths. Over the course of the next couple weeks, a virus was discovered. By the end of January, the causal agent had been identified as a coronavirus. There were thousands of cases confirmed within China, 82 cases confirmed outside of China in 18 different countries, and a high global level of risk as assessed by the World Health Organization. By the end of February, there were very significant outbreaks in East Asia, in Iran, and in Europe, and there were beginning to be smaller outbreaks in North America. As of the time of this recording, there have been nearly 350,000 deaths in the world that we know of from COVID-19, and about 100,000 here in the United States. even with the large-scale efforts that have been made so far, it has been a very bad mass casualty event, and it is still ongoing. So just briefly, and this section could be hours long all by itself, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the misinformation and misunderstandings that are going around about the coronavirus. And first of all, I want to start with the very commonly repeated sentiment that it is just a bad cold, just the flu, something like that. It is a virus that often does enter people's systems through their respiratory system. But as you saw in the physiology section, it interacts with the angiotensin system in the body, and so it can actually affect lots of different organs. It can have lots of symptoms just besides the respiratory symptoms, and it's quite different from the respiratory viruses that we're used to seeing in that it is more severe than most of them are. And so we're seeing a lot of people dying from it when we might not see so many people dying from some of the other things like seasonal flu and so forth. And it is absolutely more deadly than seasonal flu. Some people have suggested that numbers are being miscounted, that some people are counting as COVID deaths that aren't really. It's possible that that happens once in a while. Cause of death is sort of a clinical judgment sometimes, especially because most older people have some pre-existing conditions. And so that is certainly something that could be happening, but it is almost certainly far, far outweighed by the number of people who are dying at home without ever being tested. And so it's quite possible that the real numbers are twice what the confirmed numbers are. They are very, very unlikely to be any lower than what we're already counting them as. Another subject that's been sort of a hot topic, there's been a lot of confusion about, is masks. People feel like they've gotten a lot of mixed signals or changing advice as things went on. I'm going to say basically the same thing that I said during the first video that I made about this pandemic way back in February, middle of February, which is that masks decrease chances. They're not a foolproof anything of transmission, and they do more for source containment, meaning keeping a person who is sick or who has viruses coming out of their body from giving that to someone else, than what they do for keeping a healthy person from breathing it in. So if someone is wearing a mask and they cough, there are going to be a lot fewer particles going not as far out into the environment as if they were not wearing the mask. What I didn't know in February is just how many people out there are going to end up having it or being exposed to it, and the fact that, you know, it's potentially a higher exposure environment just to be out in a regular public place like the grocery store. However, enclosed spaces or spaces where there are a lot of people in a small area are of course going to be much higher risk. And of course the highest risk of all is going to be in enclosed spaces with people who are actively sick with the virus, which is mostly something that you would experience if you were a healthcare worker or if you're taking care of a family member who is ill. I believe that a lot of the misinformation that we're seeing is essentially people being in denial. And denial is a way that people react to grief, and this is definitely an occasion for grief if ever there was one. But I think it's important to not cling so much to vain hopes that maybe this isn't that bad, or that you know, that it's actually spread by 5G towers or something like that. It's really it's basically fantasy that people are indulging themselves in order to not have to look at what's really going on. And what's really going on is tragic, and it is big, and it's going to take a lot of concerted effort for things to get better. So I wanted to talk about some of the things that I've been using in my practice during this current situation. In an earlier video, I talked about using elderberry, usnea, and lemon balm to strengthen the body's immunity and prepare the body to fight off a virus should it come in contact with one. I've also been using echinacea, and it really seems that all of those are helpful for that purpose. Echinacea is a well-known herb. I think of it as being like coffee for the immune system. It makes it work over time for a brief period of time. It contains immunopolysaccharides that nourish the immune system, some anti-inflammatory compounds, and also some lichen acids that might inhibit the replication of viruses. Lemon balm helps with the symptoms of febrile illnesses, reduces fevers, and helps to make people more comfortable. And elderberry reduces fevers and contains antioxidants that may prevent viruses from being able to enter cells. Again, these are all herbs that I've given at this point to hundreds of people who were trying to stay healthy and dozens of people who were already sick. And just empirically, just from observation, it appears that they help. It appears that they seem to make people feel better and perhaps decrease the risk of getting sick by boosting nonspecific immunity. Thyme, which is shown here, is one of my all-time favorite respiratory herbs. It's an expectorant, and it has an anti-inflammatory effect on the tissue of the lungs, which is not from steroidal compounds. So it helps to keep inflammation down in the lungs, it helps to get fluid out of the lungs, and it helps to prevent secondary infection from developing. Another herb that I've been using a lot of is lobelia. Usually I'm using great blue lobelia, Lobelia syphilitica, with cayenne. And that's sort of been my first line treatment for shortness of breath. I don't actually know why it works. It may be that it's a beta agonist, probably some other things as well. But it's a traditional use for this herb, and it seems to work most of the time in the people that I've worked with COVID-19 who were experiencing some shortness of breath. The reason I'm using Lobelia syphilitica instead of the more common and stronger Lobelia inflata is because it's less emetic, it's less likely to induce vomiting, which most people just really do not want to have happen, although that does help clear the breath too sometimes. And the cayenne, which is being added to potentiate the lobelia to make its action more powerful, is based more on the strength of tradition than it is on any specific knowledge that I have of how it works chemically. I have my suspicions, but no real proof. This is licorice root. Licorice root is something that was used in China during the COVID-19's initial outbreak there. And just like COVID-19 interacts with the angiotensin, renin-angiotensin aldosterone complex in the body, licorice does also. In Chinese medicine, they say it enters all 12 channels. In Western physiology, we might say that it, interacts with this particular biochemical pathway. It seems to have some wide-ranging, non-specific counteractions of some of COVID-19's symptoms, especially the circulatory ones. And so it is something that I have been using some of the time, and it's kind of hard to quantify exactly how well it works, but people have been telling me that when they take it, it does seem to make them feel less fatigued, makes the numbness in fingers and toes go away, and maybe increases the feeling of strength or takes away some of the feeling of weakness that's sometimes caused by the virus. Carrageen, also known as sea moss or Irish moss, is another remedy that I've been using quite a bit during this pandemic. It's a soothing, demulcent remedy for the lungs. I have been giving it to people with a dry cough sometimes, but also especially after people have sort of passed the crisis point, after people are starting to recover. I'm finding that this is really helpful for them to be able to draw full breaths, be able to breathe in completely, be able to really breathe more comfortably. And so this is something that I've been using quite a bit of, mostly in the form of an infusion, and it's really been one of my favorite things, something that I've found very helpful. As of the time of this recording, there have been over 7 million cases of COVID-19 in the world and over 400,000 deaths. About a quarter of those have been here in the United States. And a lot of people are wondering what's going to happen next. What do we expect from this? And we don't really know, of course. There are a lot of different ideas, and there are a lot of different sets of information and predictions out there, ranging from the alarmist to the excessively complacent and everything in between. Part of the reason that we don't have very good answers for these questions is because the last time there was a pandemic on this scale, the world was a very different sort of place. But there are a few things that we can probably count on. And one of those things, as difficult as it may be to hear it, is that this situation is going to be with us for quite a while, possibly a very long time. Definitely a matter of years. There's no really plausible scenario in which this goes away overnight or very quickly. What hopefully will happen, best case scenario, is that efforts at mitigation will be successful and the number of cases will decline and the number of people who catch it from any given infected individual will decrease, and eventually you'll just have sporadic outbreaks here and there and not something that is present in all communities all over the place. Something that will be much more like some other outbreaks that we see that just kind of show up here and there and have hot spots that are then contained and dealt with. And hopefully that's what we'll see with this. Hopefully over the course of the next year or so, the numbers will just go down and people will keep it under control and things will get much better. There is an unfortunate flip side to that possibility, which is that people might become complacent, stop using regular hygienic precautions like face masks, like social distancing, and it might become very common again. It might become, we might have a second wave that could potentially be much larger and deadlier than the first. And that's a horrible scenario to think about, but it is certainly something that we saw in 1918 when people got tired of that pandemic and decided to ignore it and hope that it would go away. And well, it didn't, and things got much worse before they eventually got better. I think that probably the most important thing I could say about all of this is that rising above the current situation is going to take a very large group effort, and it's going to take a cultural change. People expecting things to just go back to the way they were, hoping that, you know, someone somewhere is going to find an answer for this. It's that's the road to grief, and I think that people need to recognize that some things have changed in the world and that we need to work together to make it better. You know, even if someday there's herd immunity or something like that, that's a distant outcome, and a much more immediate outcome would be for people to work together and mitigate the amount of spread until it has dwindled, like I said before. And that's going to take a lot of people not becoming complacent, and it's going to take a lot of people working together as a group, and it's probably going to take a lot of structural change to society in order for people to be able to do those things rather than just being forced to go back to work because, you know, their money runs out and their budget depends on it. So it's really going to take everyone getting together and making those changes happen, and it's really going to take everyone taking things seriously, doing their work, trying to make things better. And I think that if we all do that, that we can get through this in a much better way than if we don't. And so that's all I have to say for right now, and thank you for watching, and I will talk to you soon. And if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section, and I will do my best to answer them all. Thanks a lot.